They called it a demonstration, protocol training, a controlled exercise in defensive medicine under simulated threat conditions. But everyone standing in that compound on the morning of September 14th knew the truth. This wasn't about teaching techniques. This was about testing a woman who didn't belong. At least that's what 282 Navy SEALs believed when the sun came up that morning. They were wrong, but understanding why they were wrong requires going back. 4 years back, 4,200 miles east, to a forward operating base in Kandahar, where Captain Eliza Harlow earned a call sign that would follow her like a shadow, where she learned that survival isn't about strength, it's about precision, and that sometimes saving a life means breaking something else. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, September 2020. The first round came through the west wall at a 45-degree angle, punching a hole the size of a fist through sandbags that were supposed to stop it. The second came 3 seconds later closer, kicking up dust that hung in the air like smoke. Eliza Harlow didn't flinch. She was elbow deep in a man's spine, and flinching meant he died. The operating tent wasn't really a tent anymore. It was a canvas shell wrapped around desperation, lit by 2 battery lamps that made everything look like an old photograph. Outside voices shouted coordinates. Inside, blood ran off the table in streams that had stopped bothering her months ago. The man on the table was a SEAL. Lieutenant, 30-something. Big guy, probably 6'2" when he was standing. Right now, he wasn't standing. Wouldn't be standing again, not the way he used to. Shrapnel had turned his T12 and L1 vertebrae into fragments, and those fragments had severed his spinal cord like a knife through rope. She worked fast. Scalpel, retractor, suction. Her hands moved in rhythm, a dance she'd performed so many times it didn't require thought anymore. Just muscle memory and focus that narrowed the world down to tissue and bone and the thin line between life and death. Another round punched through the tent, closer. The lamp to her left flickered. "Captain, we need to move." The corpsman's voice cracked on the last word. Young kid, 22 maybe. First deployment. He'd seen men die before, but never like this, never while someone was trying to save them. Not done. Eliza didn't look up. Her fingers traced the edge of a metal fragment embedded in the duramater, the protective covering around the spinal cord. Pull it wrong, he bleeds out in 90 seconds. Leave it in infection, kills him in 3 days. She pulled it. Clean, smooth, dropped it in the pan with a sound like a coin falling. The SEAL's breathing changed. Shallow, fast, shock creeping in. "Hang on, Lieutenant." And she packed the wound cavity with hemostatic gauze, working from deep to superficial, creating pressure that would hold until they got him to a real hospital. "I need you to stay with me. What's your brother's name?" His voice came out wrong, slurred. "Garrett. Tell Garrett I'm sorry, won't make it to his wedding." "You'll tell him yourself." Another round. This one found the corner post and the tent sagged like something dying. The corpsman grabbed her shoulder. "Captain, they're zeroing us. We have to go." Eliza reached for her M4 carbine propped against the table, flicked the safety off with her thumb, brought it up one-handed, the stock pressed against her hip, and put 3 rounds through the west wall where the incoming fire had originated. Controlled bursts. Precise. The kind of shooting that came from a childhood in Montana where you learned to hit what you aimed at or you didn't eat. The incoming fire stopped. She set the rifle down, picked up the suture kit. "Now we wait for the bird," she said. The corpsman stared at her. She could see it in his eyes that moment when he was trying to reconcile what he'd just seen with what he thought he knew about combat medics. About women, about the rules that said you were either a shooter or a healer, but never both. She finished the closure in 6 minutes. By the time the medevac helicopter touched down, the SEAL's vitals had stabilized. Weak pulse, blood pressure low, but holding. He'd live. Whether he'd walk again was a different question. They loaded him onto the bird. The rotors kicked up dust that got in her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. She watched the helicopter rise into the pre-dawn darkness, a shadow against stars that looked exactly like the stars over Montana, and she thought about the brother. Garrett. About a wedding she just saved him from missing. About promises made by dying men who didn't know yet that they'd survived. The corpsman came up beside her, handed her a canteen. She drank without tasting the water. "Captain," he said, "that was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Eliza capped the canteen, looked at him, saw the awe in his face and knew it would turn to story, and story would turn to legend, and legend would turn into something that followed her whether she wanted it or not. That wasn't brave, she said. That was Tuesday. She walked back into the tent to clean up the blood. Naval Special Warfare Group 1, Coronado, California, September 2024, present day. 4 years later, and the blood was gone, but the reputation remained. The Pacific wind came in cold off the water, carrying salt and the smell of low tide. Eliza stood outside the main gate of Naval Special Warfare Group 1 and watched the sky turn from black to gray to that particular shade of blue that only existed in California mornings. Behind her, traffic was starting to build on Silver Strand Boulevard. Ahead, the base was waking up. Distant sound of PT formations calling cadence. The rhythmic slap of boots on concrete. Somewhere far off, a helicopter spooling up. She'd been standing there for 10 minutes, not because she was nervous. She didn't get nervous anymore. But because once she walked through that gate, things would change in ways she couldn't predict. Master Chief Douglas Kavanaugh's voice on the phone 3 days ago had been clear. I need you here. Readiness evaluation. 282 SEALs. You'll be demonstrating defensive protocols. What he hadn't said was why he needed her specifically. Why now? Why this base, this evaluation, this audience of men who'd spent their entire careers being told they were the best warriors on earth? She adjusted the ruck on her shoulder. Inside it, a customized individual first aid kit, extra hemostatic gauze, tourniquets, chest seals, the tools of her trade, but also wrapped in canvas at the bottom a kabar knife with a handle worn smooth from use. The knife Kavanaugh had given her 8 years ago, when she was 20 years old and still believed the world made sense. The guard at the gate checked her ID, waved her through. The compound spread out before her a maze of buildings and training areas that all looked the same. Concrete and chain link, and the kind of institutional architecture that existed only on military bases. She'd been here once before years ago for a joint training exercise that had lasted 3 days and taught her basically nothing, except that SEALs didn't like being told what to do by anyone who hadn't earned their respect. She found Building 7 on the south side of the compound. The door was propped open with a cinder block. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over a space that was part classroom, part gym, part something else she couldn't quite name. Mats on the floor, whiteboards on the walls covered in diagrams that looked like football plays but weren't. Equipment racks holding gear she recognized and gear she didn't. And standing in the center of it all, arms crossed, was Master Chief Douglas Kavanaugh. He looked exactly the same, 58 years old, silver beard, 6'1", weathered face that had seen too much sun and too much violence and had somehow come out the other side still believing in things like honor and duty. He wore fatigues with the creases pressed so sharp they could cut, and his boots were polished to a shine that belonged to an earlier era. The kind of soldier who still believed presentation mattered. That discipline started with how you wore your uniform and ended with whether you could be trusted when everything fell apart. He saw her, nodded once, no smile, no greeting, just that single nod that said more than words. Eliza crossed the room, dropped her ruck, stood at a kind of loose attention that wasn't quite formal but wasn't casual either. Master Chief, Captain. 8 years since she'd stood in front of him as a student. 8 years since he'd taught her that combat was 90% preparation and 10% violence, and that the 10% only worked if you'd done the 90. She'd been 20 then, fresh out of advanced training, convinced she knew everything. He'd spent 16 weeks proving she knew nothing, and by the end she'd understood that knowing nothing was the first step toward knowing something. You still carrying that kabar I gave you? His voice had a Texas accent that 40 years of military service hadn't quite erased. Every deployment. Ever needed. Kandahar. Used the pommel to break a Taliban fighter's jaw while I was closing an arterial bleed. Kavanaugh's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Approval, maybe, or recognition. That's the story I heard. Wasn't sure I believed it. It's true. Most of it, all of it. He studied her for a long moment. Outside, the sound of boots on concrete grew louder, then faded. A door slammed somewhere. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal hum. You know why you're here? He asked. Readiness evaluation. Defensive protocols demonstration. That's what I told you. That's not why you're here. Eliza waited. Kavanaugh wasn't the kind of man who got to the point quickly. He circled it, tested the ground, made sure you were ready to hear what he had to say before he said it. He walked to the equipment rack, pulled out a folder, set it on the nearest table and opened it. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, official documents with most of the text redacted. He gestured for her to look. The first photograph showed a woman in an Air Force flight suit, 30-something, dark hair pulled back, standing in front of an HH-60 Pavehawk helicopter with her arms crossed and a look on her face that said she'd heard every joke you were about to tell and had stopped finding them funny years ago. Captain Margaret Ashford, Kavanaugh said, call sign Maggie, February 1991, Operation Desert Storm. She was a convoy commander. Logistics. Not sexy work, but someone had to do it. Eliza studied the photograph. There was something in the woman's eyes, a hardness that came from being tested constantly and passing every time, but never being allowed to forget you'd been tested in the first place. I was in her convoy, Kavanaugh continued, me and 39 other soldiers. Men. Every single one of us protested her assignment, went up the chain, said we didn't want a woman in command, said she'd get us killed. He pulled out another photograph. This one showed a smoking crater in the desert, twisted metal, scorch marks, the kind of destruction that came from ordnance designed to kill people in large numbers. Scud missile, Kavanaugh said, hit our primary route 3 minutes after we were supposed to pass through. Maggie rerouted us based on intel she'd gotten from a source nobody else trusted. Saved 40 lives, mine included. Eliza looked up. Did you apologize? Every man in that convoy apologized. Maggie said the same thing to all of us. Save your apologies. Just trust competence when you see it. He closed the folder, met her eyes. You're here because what happened in 91 is happening again. Different war, different battlefield, same fight. Naval Command wants to know if female medics can handle SEAL-level harassment. Can they perform under pressure when men are actively trying to break them? They're testing integration protocols. You're the test. The words settled into the room like stones dropping into water. Who knows? Eliza asked. Me, the base commander. 2 people at Naval Special Warfare Command. That's it. As far as everyone else is concerned, this is a standard demonstration. And if I fail, Dewish, you won't. But if I do, Kavanaugh picked up the folder, held it for a moment, then set it back down. Then they'll use it as evidence that integration doesn't work, that women can't handle the pressure, that the standards need to stay where they are. He paused. But you won't fail, because I didn't spend 16 weeks training you to watch you break the first time someone tests you. Eliza felt something shift in her chest, not fear, not anger, something colder. The feeling she got before a deployment when she knew the next few months would test everything she'd ever learned about herself, and that failure wasn't an option, because failure meant people died. What's the scenario? She asked. Defensive protocols for combat medics under ambush. You'll demonstrate techniques for maintaining casualty care while engaging hostile threats. 282 SEALs will be watching. Some of them will be respectful. Some won't. How bad? Bad enough that I specifically requested you, because you can handle it. Eliza looked at the folder again, at the photograph of Captain Margaret Ashford standing in front of her helicopter 33 years ago, surrounded by men who didn't want her there and didn't believe she could do the job. Surrounded by men who'd learned they were wrong, but only after she'd proven it in blood and fire and narrow margins. When do I start? Eliza asked. 0800 hours. Formation at the main training compound. Bring your gear, bring your temper, leave your rank at the door. Why? Because rank won't protect you today. Only skill will. He walked to the door, stopped, turned back. One more thing. You'll have 2 demonstration partners for the final scenario. Volunteers. One of them specifically requested to work with you. Senior operator named Garrett Brennan. The name hit like a fist. Eliza kept her face neutral, but her mind was already 4 years back. Kandahar, a tent full of blood, a man on a table with his spine in pieces, a voice slurred by shock and pain. Tell Garrett I'm sorry. Won't make it to his wedding. Is there a problem? Kavanaugh asked. No, Master Chief. You're lying. Yes, Master Chief. He smiled, barely, just a slight shift at the corner of his mouth. Good, because if this was easy, I wouldn't have called you. He left. The door swung shut behind him. Eliza stood alone in the training room. Outside, the base continued waking up. Voices, boots, engines, the machinery of military life grinding forward the way it always did, indifferent to individual stories, individual struggles, individual moments where everything changed. She walked to the window, looked out at the compound. Somewhere out there, Garrett Brennan was getting ready for the demonstration, getting ready to face the woman who'd saved his brother's life but couldn't save his brother's legs, who'd made a choice in a tent full of blood and bullets, choosing life over mobility, breathing over walking. And she knew with a certainty that came from 8 years of learning to read men in combat that Garrett Brennan hadn't requested to work with her because he wanted to thank her. He wanted to punish her. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the K-bar knife Kavanaugh had given her. The handle was worn smooth from 8 years of carrying it everywhere. The blade had been sharpened so many times the original manufacturer's stamp was almost gone. It had been with her in 3 deployments, had cut through uniforms and rope and plastic ties, and once memorably through a Taliban fighter's rifle sling when she'd run out of ammunition and options. She turned it over in her hands, felt the weight, felt the balance, the promise it represented. Master Chief Kavanaugh had given it to her on the last day of training 8 years ago, had placed it in her hands and said, "You'll know when you need this. And when that day comes, don't hesitate, because hesitation is what gets people killed." She slid it back into her pocket. 0542 hours. 2 hours and 18 minutes until the demonstration started. 2 hours and 18 minutes until she stood in front of 282 Navy SEALs and proved that competence had no gender. Or failed to prove it, or something in between that would be measured and judged and used as evidence in arguments she'd never hear by people she'd never meet. She picked up her ruck, checked her gear one more time. IFAC, tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, chest seals, gloves, all of it organized exactly the way she'd organized it for the past 8 years. Muscle memory, routine, the small rituals that separated professionals from amateurs. At the bottom of the ruck, wrapped in canvas, was something else, something she'd carried since Kandahar, but had never told anyone about. A photograph, worn at the edges, faded. It showed a man in a hospital bed, pale and thin, with tubes running out of his arms and a brace around his neck. But he was smiling. And next to the bed, in a wheelchair that looked too big for him, sat another man. Same eyes, same jaw. Brothers. On the back of the photograph, written in shaky handwriting, "Thank you for my life, Nate Brennan." Eliza had received it 6 months after Kandahar, a package forwarded through official channels. The photograph, a short letter, nothing dramatic, just a man thanking her for doing her job, for making a choice when choices were measured in seconds and consequences lasted decades. She'd kept it, not out of pride, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that every choice had weight, that medicine wasn't just about bodies, it was about lives, about the people connected to those bodies, brothers, wives, children, futures that hung in the balance while you worked with a bloody hands in places where the bullets didn't stop just because you were trying to save someone. She put the photograph back, zipped the ruck closed. 0547 hours. Time to see if 4 years had been enough for Garrett Brennan to understand that his brother was alive because of her, or if 4 years had just given him more time to blame her for the wheelchair. The briefing room was smaller than she'd expected. 12 chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a podium and a whiteboard that still had yesterday's notes on it. Something about close quarters battle tactics, angles of approach, fatal funnels, the language of violence organized into diagrams. Kavanaugh was there. So was another man, younger, 35 maybe, tall, built like someone who'd spent a decade lifting heavy things and running long distances. Tribal tattoos covered his forearms, the kind that looked impressive until you realized everyone had them now. His name tape read Brennan. Liza felt something cold settle in her stomach. Garrett Brennan looked exactly like his brother. Same eyes, same jaw, same way of standing with his weight slightly forward, like he was always ready to move. The difference was in the expression. Where Nathaniel had looked at her with gratitude, Garrett looked at her with something else. Something harder, colder. Recognition flashed across his face when he saw her. Not surprise. He'd known she was coming, had known and had requested this assignment anyway. Standing next to him was another SEAL, younger, maybe 26, leaner. The kind of kid who hadn't quite figured out yet that cockiness was a liability in combat. His name tape read Hollister. Kavanaugh made the introductions with the efficient brutality of a man who didn't believe in small talk. Captain Eliza Harlow, Senior Operator Garrett Brennan, Trainee Wade Hollister. You'll be working together for the final demonstration scenario. Garrett didn't extend his hand, neither did Wade. They just stood there measuring her, making calculations, drawing conclusions based on height and weight and gender and every assumption they'd brought with them. You're the medic from Kandahar. Garrett's voice was flat, neutral, the kind of neutral that took effort to maintain. Yes. 4 years ago, FOB Dwyer, my brother. Lieutenant Nathaniel Brennan, T-12L1 spinal injury, shrapnel extraction under hostile fire. He survived. He's in a wheelchair. He's alive. The words hung in the air between them. Eliza could feel Wade watching, Kavanaugh too. This moment was a test. Everything was a test. Speech was a test. Silence was a test. How you stood and how you breathed and whether you looked away first. She didn't look away. Garrett's jaw tightened. My brother will never walk again because of choices you made. Your brother is alive to hold his daughters because of choices I made. Something flickered behind Garrett's eyes. Surprise, maybe. That she knew about the daughters, that she'd kept track, that this wasn't just a patient to her. It was a person, a life, a family. He'd rather be dead than useless, Garrett said. The words were meant to wound. Eliza could hear it in his tone. The calculated cruelty, the assumption that she'd flinch, apologize, back down. She stepped forward. One step, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, close enough that he could see she wasn't afraid. Then that's his brother's failure, she said quietly, not mine. Garrett's hands curled into fists. Wade's eyes went wide. Kavanaugh didn't move, but she could feel him watching, calculating, ready to intervene if this went somewhere it shouldn't. It didn't go anywhere. Garrett just stood there, breathing hard, trying to decide if she'd insulted him or his brother or both, trying to process the fact that she'd pushed back instead of retreating, that she wasn't playing the game the way he'd expected. Finally, he stepped back, uncurled his fists. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. It just sank below the surface, waiting. The demonstration is at 0800, Kavanaugh said. His voice cut through the tension like a knife. Captain Harlow will explain defensive protocols. You two will act as simulated attackers. Full contact authorized within training parameters. Understood. Understood. Master Chief, Wade said. Garrett said nothing, just stared at Eliza with eyes that promised this wasn't over. Kavanaugh dismissed them. Wade left first. Garrett lingered for a moment, then followed. When they were gone, Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That went well, Kavanaugh said dryly. He hates me. Yes. He's going to try to hurt me out there. Yes. You knew that when you approved him. Kavanaugh walked to the window, looked out at the compound. Morning sun was burning off the fog, now turning everything sharp and clear. In 91, he said, I didn't trust Captain Ashford because she was a woman. I told myself it was about standards, qualifications, experience, but it wasn't. It was about fear. Fear that if she could do my job, then maybe my job wasn't as special as I'd been told. Maybe I wasn't as special as I'd been told. He turned back to face her. Garrett Brennan is afraid of you, not because you're weak, because you're not. Because you made a choice his brother accepted, but he can't. Because you represent something he doesn't want to admit exists. A woman who's better at combat medicine than most men, who can shoot and heal in the same breath, who doesn't need his approval or his respect because she's already earned it from people who matter. So you're using me to teach him a lesson. I'm using him to give you an opportunity to show 282 SEALs what happens when skill meets prejudice, when competence meets assumption. He paused. You asked me earlier what happens if you fail. Here's a better question. What happens when you succeed? Eliza thought about it, about standing in front of nearly 300 men and proving something they didn't want to believe, about Garrett Brennan's hatred and Wade Hollister's skepticism and all the invisible weight of expectation and doubt. They'll hate me more, she said. Some of them. But some of them will see what Captain Ashford made me see. That fear is just ignorance with a louder voice. He picked up his cover, settled it on his head with the precision that came from 40 years of practice. Turo 800 hours, main compound. Don't be late. Master Chief. He stopped at the door. The kabar you gave me. You said I'd know when I needed it. You will. Is today that day? Kavanaugh smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. Today's the day you find out. He left. Eliza stood alone in the briefing room. Through the window, she could see the compound filling with people. SEALs gathering for morning formation. Small clusters forming and reforming. The social dynamics of military life playing out in patterns that looked random, but weren't. Somewhere in one of those clusters was Garrett Brennan, telling Wade Hollister about his brother, about Kandahar, about the medic who'd crippled a SEAL and now had the audacity to stand in front of them and pretend she belonged. The story would spread, mutate. By the time EO 800 rolled around, she'd be the villain. The woman who'd failed, who'd made mistakes, who'd cost a good man his legs because she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, good enough. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter. Narrative did, and right now Garrett was controlling the narrative. She pulled out her phone, pulled up a contact she hadn't called in 4 years, stared at it for a long moment, then put the phone away. Whatever happened in the next 2 hours, Nathaniel Brennan didn't need to know about it. Didn't need to be caught between his brother's anger and his gratitude. Didn't need to choose. Some battles you fought alone. Eliza checked her watch. 06:53 hours. 7 minutes until she needed to head to the compound. 7 minutes to center herself. To remember her training. To become the person Kavanaugh's had taught her to be 8 years ago in a different training facility that felt like it belonged to a different life. She closed her eyes, breathed. 4 counts in, hold 4. 4 counts out, hold 4. Tactical breathing. The kind that slowed your heart rate and cleared your mind and prepared your body for violence. Because that's what this was, despite the sanitized language. Violence. Controlled. Sanctioned. Wrapped in protocols and training parameters. But violence nonetheless. And violence was something Eliza Harlow understood better than most people would ever know. She opened her eyes, picked up her ruck, walked out into the California morning where 282 Navy SEALs were waiting to see if she'd break. They were going to be disappointed. The training compound sprawled across 3 acres of concrete and chain link, bordered on the west by the Pacific and on the east by buildings that had been standing since before Eliza was born. Someone had drawn lines on the concrete in white paint, creating a ring 20 feet in diameter. Around that ring, 282 Navy SEALs stood in loose formation, arranged in concentric circles that reminded her of something ancient, gladiatorial. The kind of setup where outcomes mattered and witnesses remembered. The morning had burned off the last of the fog. Clear sky now, sun already hot despite the ocean breeze. Eliza could taste salt on her lips as she walked through the outer ring of SEALs, feeling their eyes track her movement. Some curious, some dismissive, some openly hostile. She'd learned years ago not to waste energy trying to categorize them. They'd categorize themselves soon enough by how they reacted. Master Chief Kavanaugh stood at the north edge of the ring, arms crossed, face unreadable. Next to him, a Navy commander she didn't recognize. Silver oak leaves on his collar. The kind of officer who showed up when something mattered to people above his pay grade. Garrett Brennan and Wade Hollister stood at the south edge. Garrett had his arms crossed too, mirroring Kavanaugh's posture, but with a different energy. Where Kavanaugh's stance suggested patience, Garrett suggested coiled violence. Wade bounced slightly on the balls of his feet, trying to look relaxed and failing. Eliza walked to the center of the ring. Set her ruck down. The concrete was warm under her boots. She could hear small sounds amplified by the silence. Boot scrapes, someone coughing, the distant hum of a helicopter miles away. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there letting them look, letting them see a woman 5'7", 145, auburn hair pulled back in a tactical bun that wouldn't come loose if someone grabbed it. Standard issue fatigues. No rank insignia on her chest, just a name tape that read, Harlow. Medical kit clipped to her belt, M18 holstered on her hip. Nothing special, nothing threatening, just another soldier. That was the first lesson. Let them underestimate you before you teach them why they shouldn't. She turned to Kavanaugh, nodded once. He stepped forward, his voice carried across the compound with the authority of 4 decades in uniform. Gentlemen, you're here for a demonstration of defensive protocols for combat medics operating under hostile conditions. Your instructor is Captain Eliza Harlow. 3 deployments. Bronze Star with Valor. She will demonstrate techniques for maintaining casualty care while engaging threats at close quarters. You will observe. You will learn. You will keep your mouth shut unless you have an intelligent question. Someone in the crowd snickered. Kavanaugh's head snapped toward the sound. Did I say something funny, petty officer? The snickering stopped. Kavanaugh stepped back. The ring belonged to Eliza now. She looked out at the faces, found the ones who were paying attention, really paying attention. The older ones, mostly. Men who'd been in combat long enough to recognize competence when they saw it, regardless of packaging. Those were the ones she needed to reach. The rest would follow, or they wouldn't. I'm not here to prove women belong in combat, she said. Her voice didn't carry the same way Kavanaugh's did, but it was clear. Steady. That's been proven. I'm here to show you what happens when you're treating a casualty and someone decides you're the next target. She gestured to her medical kit. Field medics are high-value targets. We carry morphine antibiotic supplies that enemy forces want. We're focused on wounded personnel, which makes us vulnerable. And in close quarters combat, vulnerable means dead, unless you know how to turn vulnerability into advantage. A voice from the crowd. How's a 140-pound medic going to turn anything into an advantage against a 200-pound fighter? Eliza didn't look for the source, just kept her eyes on the middle distance. Physics. That got their attention. She gestured to the first volunteer, a SEAL she'd been briefed about. Second class, 200 pounds, respectful. He stepped into the ring and stood where she indicated, about 7 feet away. The scenario, she said, is simple. I'm treating a wounded soldier. She knelt next to an imaginary casualty. Hostile approaches from behind. The SEAL moved toward her, slow telegraphed. My objective isn't to win a fight. It's to create a window where I can either escape or neutralize the threat long enough to complete medical treatment. The SEAL reached for her shoulder. Eliza moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just efficient. Her body rotated, left shoulder dipping, as her right elbow came up and caught the underside of his extending arm. His momentum carried him forward, which was exactly what she wanted. She used it, pulled where he was already pushing. His weight shifted onto his front foot, and she stepped into the space he'd vacated, her hip against his, and suddenly his center of gravity was somewhere he couldn't control it. He went down, not hard, controlled. Her hand on his wrist, guiding the fall, making sure he landed on his shoulder instead of his head. She released him. Stepped back. Returned to her kneeling position next to the imaginary casualty. Total elapsed time 3 seconds. The SEAL stood up, nodded, backed out of the ring. Eliza looked at the crowd. Some of them were leaning forward now. Others still had their arms crossed, but the body language had shifted. Skepticism hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something else, curiosity. That worked, someone said, because he was helping you. Eliza stood. Volunteer. A different SEAL stepped forward. Bigger, maybe 240, senior chief based on his collar. He didn't look friendly. Same scenario, Eliza said, but this time full speed within training parameters. Try to grab me. Actually try. The senior chief grinned, not a nice grin. Yes, ma'am. She knelt again, turned her back to him, heard his boots on concrete moving faster than the first volunteer, closing the distance in 2 long strides. Felt the air move as his hand reached for her. She dropped and pivoted. His hand closed on empty space where her shoulder had been. Her hands caught his wrist, both of them pulling him forward and down while she rose and turned. 240 pounds of forward momentum met a rotational force that used that momentum against itself. Basic physics, basic biomechanics. The kind of thing you learned if someone taught you and you practiced 10,000 times until your body understood it better than your brain. The senior chief hit the mat, harder than the first volunteer. Not quite controlled. She'd pulled the force at the last second, but he still landed with a sound that made people wince. He stayed down for 2 seconds, then pushed himself up, shaking his head. Looked at her with different eyes now, respect starting to edge out the skepticism. How, he asked. Your momentum was approximately 1,100 pound-feet of force. I applied 15 pounds of lateral pressure at a 12-inch moment arm. The math did the rest. She helped him to his feet. He nodded to her once and returned to the formation. The crowd's energy was different now. She could feel it. Not convinced yet, but paying attention. That was enough for now. She ran 3 more demonstrations. Different techniques, different angles of approach. Each time the volunteers got more aggressive, and each time she adapted. Showed them how size didn't matter when you understood leverage. How strength was irrelevant when you knew where joints failed under rotational stress. How fear could be managed with breathing and training and the simple act of practicing the same movements until they became automatic. By the 4th demonstration, some of the SEALs were asking questions. Real questions. About angles, about timing, about the specific physics of momentum redirection. Garrett Brennan hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Just stood at the edge of the ring with his arms still crossed and his eyes locked on Eliza like he was trying to find the flaw. The weakness. The moment where she'd reveal herself as fraud or failure or whatever narrative he'd built in his head over 4 years of blaming her for his brother's wheelchair. Wade Hollister whispered something to him. Garrett's response was too quiet to hear, but the expression on his face said enough. Eliza turned to face them directly for the first time. Final demonstration, she said. 2 attacker scenario, simultaneous threat from different angles. Different protocol because you can't redirect 2 people the same way you redirect 1. She looked at Kavanaugh. He gave the slightest nod. Senior Operator Brennan, Trainee Hollister, you're up. They stepped into the ring. Garrett moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Wade tried to match it but couldn't quite hide his nervousness. They were both bigger than the previous volunteers, heavier, and they had something the others hadn't. Motivation beyond following orders. Garrett wanted to hurt her. She could see it at the way he rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, adjusted his stance. The small rituals of violence preparing itself. Wade just wanted to impress Garrett, which made him predictable. Kavanaugh stepped forward. Demonstration parameters. Captain Harlow will be in a treatment position. You 2 will approach from different angles. Full contact authorized within training limits. Head strikes prohibited. Intentional trauma prohibited. Acknowledge. Acknowledged, Wade said quickly. Garrett said nothing, just stared at Eliza. Senior Operator, I need verbal acknowledgement. Acknowledged. The word came out flat, empty of everything except the bare minimum of compliance. Eliza knelt in the center of the ring. Behind her, 282 Navy SEALs had gone quiet in the way crowds do when they sense something about to happen. Not entertainment, something else. Something that would be remembered and talked about later in places where stories became legends, became warnings. She centered herself, 4-count breathing, in, hold, out, hold. The world narrowed down to physical sensation, concrete under her knees, sun on her shoulders, salt air, the distant sound of traffic on Silver Strand Boulevard. And in her peripheral vision, 2 men positioning themselves at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, spacing themselves for a coordinated attack. 2 attacker defensive protocol, she said, voice carrying across the silence. The objective is survival and escape, not victory, not dominance, just creating enough space to either retreat or neutralize the immediate threat while maintaining the ability to continue medical treatment. She looked at Garrett, at Wade. Let them see that she knew exactly what they were planning. This is live combat simulation. Strikes will be real. Injuries are possible. Acknowledge the risk. We acknowledge, Wade said. Garrett smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Oh, we acknowledge. Eliza took her hands off her knees. Let them hang loose at her sides. Then let's begin. 3 seconds of absolute stillness. Then Garrett and Wade moved. Not the controlled approach of the earlier demonstrations, not the telegraphed attacks designed to make the instructor look good. This was real, fast, coordinated. The kind of movement that came from men who'd trained together, who knew each other's rhythms, who'd planned exactly what they were going to do. They launched simultaneous kicks. Garrett from the right aiming for her ribs, Wade from the left targeting her hip and thigh. Both committed fully, both using real force. Eliza saw it coming, but half a second too late. She started to shift her weight, started to rotate out of the line of attack, but there wasn't enough time. Garrett's boot caught her in the side. Wade's caught her leg. Double impact. 230 pounds and 190 both moving at full speed, both hitting her in the same instant. The concrete came up fast. She hit hard. Right side, shoulder first, then hip, then her head, just barely missing the ground because she managed to tuck her chin at the last second. The breath exploded out of her lungs in a sound that was part grunt, part gasp, all pain. The world tilted, went bright at the edges. She could hear nothing, see nothing, just the sensation of concrete under her cheek and her body trying to remember how to breathe and failing. Then sound came back, boots on concrete, someone shouting. Kavanaugh's voice sharp with command saying something she couldn't process. And above it all, laughter. Wade's voice. Oops, reflex. Garrett's voice quieter. You okay, ma'am? False concern, real malice. Eliza lay there for 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Time moves strange when your body was trying to decide if it was injured or just hurt. There was a difference. Injured meant something was broken or torn or damaged in a way that wouldn't heal right. Hurt just meant pain, and pain was temporary. She cataloged sensations. Ribs ached, but moved when she breathed. No grinding, no sharp edges, bruised, not cracked. Hip throbbed, but bore weight when she tested it. Leg tingled, but responded to neural signals. Blood in her mouth from where she'd bitten her lip. Hurt, not injured. She could work with hurt. Round her, the crowd was absolutely silent. 282 men holding their breath, waiting to see if she'd stay down or get up, or start crying, or any of the 100 other reactions they expected from someone who'd just been double-kicked to the concrete by 2 Navy SEALs who'd hit her like they meant it. Eliza put her right hand flat on the ground. Pushed. Her body argued, but obeyed. She rolled to her knees, spit blood. Stood. Her vision swam for a second, then cleared. Garrett and Wade stood 8 feet away. Garrett's expression was carefully neutral now, but she could see calculation behind it. Wade looked uncertain, like he just realized that what had seemed like a good idea 30 seconds ago might have consequences. The crowd was still silent, waiting. Eliza wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, looked at the blood on her glove, looked at Garrett and Wade. When she spoke, her voice was different, not louder, but colder. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the space between her and them. You just activated live response protocol. This is no longer a demonstration. This is combat. She reached up, unpinned the captain's bars from her collar, held them for a moment, then walked to Kavanaugh and placed them in his hand. I'm not an officer in this ring, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm a combatant. Kavanaugh looked at the rank insignia in his palm, looked at her. She could see the question in his eyes. Are you sure? She nodded once. He closed his fist around the bars, stepped back. Eliza returned to the center of the ring. Her body was screaming at her. Ribs on fire, hip throbbing. But pain was just noise, and she'd learned a long time ago how to turn the volume down. Garrett and Wade hadn't moved. They were watching her now with different eyes, starting to understand that something had shifted, that the rules had changed in ways they hadn't anticipated. At the edge of the ring, someone wheeled forward through the crowd. A man in a wheelchair, silver-haired, thin. Eliza recognized him even from 20 feet away. Nathaniel Brennan, Garrett's older brother, the SEAL she'd saved 4 years ago in a tent full of blood and bullets. He stopped at the absolute front of the crowd, didn't speak, just watched. Garrett saw his brother. Something flickered across his face. Confusion, anger, something else she couldn't identify. Nate, he said, what are you doing here? Nathaniel's voice carried across the compound, quiet but clear. Watching. This doesn't concern you. It does. Garrett turned back to Eliza. The muscle in his jaw was jumping. We gonna do this or not? Eliza adjusted her stance, weight slightly back, hands loose at her sides. The posture looked relaxed, but every SEAL in that compound who'd spent time in actual combat recognized it for what it was. Ready position. the stance you took when violence was coming and preparation time was over. In Kandahar, she said, still in that cold voice, I performed a T-12L1 spinal extraction on your brother while taking incoming fire from 3 Taliban fighters. I killed 2 of them with my sidearm. The third one I put down with the pommel of a medical scalpel while I was closing your brother's arterial bleed. And when the medevac landed, I carried him to the bird myself because the corpsman had taken shrapnel to the leg and couldn't lift. She took 1 step forward. Garrett and Wade didn't move, but their postures changed, tightened. I saved his life, Eliza continued, gave him 20 more years with his wife, with his daughters. He accepted the trade. Legs for life. You didn't. You spent 4 years blaming me for a choice I made in 90 seconds while people were trying to kill us both. Another step forward. She was 10 feet away now, close enough that they could reach her in 2 strides, close enough that there was no retreat, no escape, just forward into whatever happened next. So here's what's going to happen, she said. You're going to attack me again. And this time I'm not going to demonstrate technique. I'm going to stop you. And stopping 200-pound men who want to hurt me requires breaking things. Joints, bones, the structural components that allow you to keep attacking. This is live response protocol. This is what combat medics do when someone forces the choice between their safety and someone else's violence. She looked at Kavanaugh. Master Chief, clear the protocols. Full defensive response authorized. Medical standing by. Kavanaugh's expression was unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he turned to the commander standing next to him. The officer nodded. Authorized, Kavanaugh said, but I'm calling it the second someone's injured beyond training parameters. Eliza looked back at Garrett and Wade. You forced this, both of you. Remember that. At the ring's edge, Nathaniel Brennan spoke again. This time his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of 282 men holding their breath it carried. I've seen that look before. In Kandahar, right before she put down 3 Taliban fighters while operating on me. Garrett heard him. Eliza could see it in the way his eyes widened slightly. The first crack in his certainty. But Wade was younger, stupider, still convinced that size and strength and aggressive intent were enough. He came at her first. Eliza's body remembered 8 years of training before her mind even registered the movement. Wade's lunge was fast but overcommitted. He reached for her plate carrier, trying to grab and overwhelm with superior weight. Amateur mistake. He'd put his center of gravity too far forward, chasing the grab instead of securing his base. She didn't try to stop his momentum. That would have required strength she didn't have. Instead, she moved with it, rotated outside his reach. Her hands caught his right wrist, both hands, firm grip. And as his weight carried him forward, she pulled in the same direction he was already moving. Physics, leverage. The moment arm length times apply, force equals torque. Wade's feet left the ground for a fraction of a second as his momentum exceeded his ability to control it. Eliza pivoted, still holding his wrist, and dropped her weight while pulling down and forward. He had no choice but to follow. His body described an arc through the air and impacted the concrete with his left side. But she wasn't done. As he fell, she'd already identified the target. His planted right leg, the one still bearing weight as he went down. She stepped behind it, using his body as a shield from Garrett, and drove her right heel into the fibula head just below his knee. The sound was distinct, sharp, wet, different from the sound of flesh hitting concrete. This was internal, structural. The sound of bone failing under force it wasn't designed to handle. Wade screamed, not the grunt of pain from getting hit, not the sharp cry of surprise. This was different, higher, more primal. The kind of sound that came from damage your body recognized as serious before your brain fully processed what had happened. Eliza released his wrist, stepped back, dropped to one knee to assess. All of this happened in 4 seconds. Garrett was moving now, but he'd hesitated. That half second of watching Wade fall had cost him his window. Eliza was already turning, already tracking his movement, already calculating angles and momentum and the physics of what came next. He charged her. Not a grab like Wade. Garrett knew better. He came in low and fast, trying to close the distance before she could create the space she needed for leverage techniques. Smart, but not smart enough. She rotated, not away from him, toward him, into the attack, counterintuitive. exactly what Kavanaugh had drilled into her 8 years ago. They expect you to retreat, so advance. They expect you to block, so redirect. Do what they don't expect. Garrett's right arm was extended, reaching for her. She caught his wrist with her left hand, stepped inside his reach with her right foot. Her right forearm drove laterally into the medial side of his right knee. 15 pounds of force. That's all she applied. 15 pounds at the moment when Garrett's full body weight, 230 pounds moving at approximately 5 miles per hour, was committed to that forward step. When his knee was locked straight, bearing all his weight designed for flexion and extension, but catastrophically vulnerable to lateral stress. The medial collateral ligament tore first, completely. The sound was like fabric ripping, but deeper, wetter. Then the tibial plateau, the top surface of the shin bone where it articulates with the femur, fractured under the compressive overload of 230 pounds, suddenly redirected 90 degrees from its intended path. Garrett went down, not the controlled fall of a trained operator trying to minimize damage. This was involuntary, structural. His legs simply stopped supporting weight in any meaningful way, and his body had no choice but to follow. He hit the concrete and started screaming before his shoulder made contact. 7 seconds, 2 men down, 2 legs destroyed. Eliza stood in the center of the ring, breathing hard blood from her split lip running down her chin. Around her, 282 Navy SEALs stood in absolute silence. Not the silence of anticipation, the silence of shock, of men watching something they hadn't believed was possible and now having to rebuild their understanding of the world to accommodate what they'd just seen. She didn't celebrate, didn't pose, just turned immediately to Wade, who was curling around his shattered fibula, face white with shock. "Medic," her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Wade's losing diesel pulse. I need a splint and gauze. Now." 2 base medics broke from the crowd, sprinting forward with their trauma kits. Eliza dropped to her knees next to Wade, her hands already moving with the automatic precision of 8 years of combat medicine. "Stay still," she told him. Her voice was different now, not cold anymore, clinical, professional. The voice of someone who'd just transitioned from combatant back to healer in the space between heartbeats. "Your ankle is dislocated. I'm checking vascular flow." Her fingers found the dorsalis pedis pulse point on the top of his foot. Weak, thready, not absent but compromised. She checked capillary refill in his toes. Slow, too slow. Grade 3 ankle dislocation, she told the arriving medics. Probable spiral fibula fracture. Dorsalis pedis pulse present but weak 2+. Capillary refill delayed. Compartment syndrome risk is high. Manual reduction required within 5 minutes or we're looking at permanent vascular damage. The medics moved with her instructions, not questioning following her lead because she was clearly the most experienced trauma responder in the compound. One started setting up for the reduction. The other moved to Garrett. Eliza turned to the second medic. Garrett's knee, palpable MCL defect. Positive anterior drawer test suggests ACL involvement. Tibial plateau step-off is palpable. Immobilize at 15 degrees flexion. Ice, elevate. He's going to need surgery within 24 hours. The medic nodded and went to work. Garrett was still screaming, but quieter now. The kind of noise that came from pain too big to express with volume. He was staring at his leg at the angle that was wrong, at the swelling, already starting to distort the shape of his knee. Eliza moved to him, knelt beside him. He tried to pull away, but he couldn't move without triggering waves of pain that made his vision go white. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, quiet enough that only he could hear. "I didn't want this, but you forced the choice. You and Wade. You attacked me with intent to injure during a training demonstration. I defended myself with minimal necessary force to stop the threat. The breaks are biomechanical consequences of your own momentum. I didn't create them. You did." Garrett's eyes focused on her face. She could see hatred there, pain, but also something else. The first edge of understanding starting to cut through everything else. "My brother," he gasped, "is alive because I made a choice. Today, you made me make another one. This is what combat medics do, Garrett. We save lives when we can. We stop threats when we must. Sometimes we have to do both at the same time, like I did in Kandahar, like I just did here." She stood, stepped back, let the medics work. The crowd was still frozen. Then slowly movement started. Someone whispered. Someone else took a step back. The circles around the ring began to dissolve as men backed away, not out of fear, but out of that instinctive human response to violence that's gone wrong in ways that can't be undone. Master Chief Kavanaugh walked into the ring. His face was carefully neutral, but Eliza could see approval in his eyes. Not happiness, not satisfaction, but recognition. The look a teacher gives a student who's just passed a test they didn't know they were taking. He handed her the captain's bars she'd given him. "Put these back on," he said. "You're an officer again." Eliza took them. Her hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, but she managed to pin them back to her collar without dropping them. Behind Kavanaugh, Nathaniel Brennan was wheeling closer. He navigated through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent 4 years learning how to move through spaces designed for people who walked. He stopped at the edge of the ring, looked at his brother on the ground, looked at Eliza. "Captain Harlow," he said. "Lieutenant Brennan, my brother just learned what I learned in Kandahar, that you do what's necessary, nothing more, nothing less, that you don't choose violence, you respond to it." Garrett was listening. Eliza could see it in the way his head turned slightly toward his brother's voice, even though his eyes were squeezed shut against the pain. "He'll hate me more now," Eliza said. "For a while." Nathaniel looked at his brother. "But hate is exhausting. Eventually you run out of energy for it. Then you have to face what's underneath. And what's underneath is usually just fear." He wheeled back. The crowd parted for him automatically. The medics were loading Garrett onto a stretcher. Wade was already secured, his legs splinted, and elevated an IV running fluids to combat shock. Both men would be in surgery within hours. Both would recover, though the timeline was measured in months, not weeks. Kavanaugh gestured to the commander who'd been watching from the sidelines. The officer approached, and the three of them stood in a small triangle while around them the compound slowly came back to life. "Investigation will start immediately," the commander said. His name tape read Torres. "You'll need to give a formal statement." "Understood, sir. The footage is clear, multiple angles. This will go to JAG, but based on what I just watched, I don't anticipate charges." "Yes, sir." Torres looked at the stretchers being carried away, at the blood on the concrete, at the 282 witnesses still processing what they'd seen. "Master Chief Kavanaugh recommended you for this assignment. Told me you could handle pressure. I didn't fully understand what he meant until now." He extended his hand. Eliza shook it. "You've got 2 hours to clean up and report for formal statement," Torres said. "Use them. You look like you've been through a war." "Just a demonstration, sir." Torres almost smiled. That's one word for it. He walked away, already on his radio, coordinating the aftermath. Kavanaugh and Eliza stood alone in the ring. The crowd was dispersing, now small groups forming, conversations starting. The social processing of trauma. Everyone trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed, trying to fit it into narratives that made sense. Stories they could tell later that would explain away the cognitive dissonance of watching a woman half their size break 2 Navy SEALs in 7 seconds. "How do you feel?" Kavanaugh asked. "Like I've been kicked by 2 Navy SEALs." "That's because you have. How do you really feel?" Eliza was quiet for a moment, testing her body, her mind, the space between who she'd been when she walked into this ring and who she was now that she was walking out. "I feel like I proved something," she said finally. "I'm just not sure it was worth proving." It was. They'll hate me now, not just Garrett, all of them. Some will, some won't. The ones who matter will see what needs to be seen. He paused. "In '91, I hated Captain Ashford until she saved my life. Then I spent 30 years grateful I'd been wrong. Garrett will get there, eventually. And if he doesn't, then that's his burden to carry, not yours. You did your both jobs. Medic and warrior, same day, same ring. That's what integration looks like. Not speeches, not policies. Performance under pressure that can't be denied." He started to walk away, then stopped. "Oh, and Captain, as of right now, you're assigned as Chief Instructor for the Combat Medicine Integration Program. First class starts in 6 weeks. 20 female medics. Your job is to teach them how to do exactly what you just did." Eliza stared at him. Master Chief, I just broke two men's legs. Yes, you did. After they assaulted you during a training exercise. After you gave clear warning. After you removed your rank to make absolutely certain there was no question about whether this was assault on a superior officer or mutual combat. You documented everything. You responded proportionally, and you immediately rendered medical aid. He met her eyes. That's the lesson, not the violence, the control, the precision, the choice to use force only when forced. That's what those 20 women need to learn. He walked away. Eliza stood alone in the empty ring, blood on her lip, bruises forming on her ribs and hip, hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline that had nowhere else to go. Around her, the compound continued its morning routine. People had places to be, things to do. The machinery of military life grinding forward, regardless of individual dramas. But she knew with the certainty that came from 8 years of learning how stories spread in military communities, that what had happened in this ring would follow her, would define her, would become the first thing people thought of when they heard her name. The medic who broke 2 seals, the woman who proved competence with violence, the Reaper. She picked up her ruck, started walking toward the medical building where she'd give her statement and fill out paperwork and begin the official process of turning 7 seconds of combat into documentation that would be read by people who weren't there and didn't understand. Behind her, a small group of SEALs remained near the ring. She could hear their voices, quiet, intense. Did you see that 7 seconds? She gave them a chance. They didn't take it. That's not combat training. That's something else. She kept walking. Let them talk. Let them process. Let them rebuild their understanding of what was possible and who was capable and what integration actually meant when it left the realm of policy and entered the realm of performance. 6 weeks until her first class, 20 female medics who would arrive expecting to learn combat medicine and would instead learn what Eliza had learned today. That respect isn't given. It's earned through precision that can't be denied, through choices made under pressure, through the willingness to break things when breaking things is what survival requires. She touched the K-bar knife in her pocket, the one Kavanaugh had given her 8 years ago, with the promise that she'd know when she needed it. She'd been wrong about today. She hadn't needed the knife. She'd needed everything that knife represented. The training, the preparation, the willingness to use violence when violence was forced on her, the discipline to stop the moment the threat was neutralized. Master Chief Kavanaugh had trained her for this day 8 years ago. He'd known it was coming, had prepared her for it, had given her the tools and then stepped back to let her prove she knew how to use them. 7 seconds, 2 broken legs, 282 witnesses. One promise kept to a man who'd believed in her when belief was dangerous, who'd vouched for her when vouching was unpopular, who'd sent her into this ring knowing she'd either prove him right or make him look like a fool. She'd proven him right, but the cost was measured in shattered bones, in screaming men, and a reputation that would follow her for the rest of her career. Eliza walked into the medical building and wondered if proving herself had been worth it. Then she thought about the 20 women arriving in 6 weeks. The women who wouldn't have to break anyone to earn respect because she'd broken 2 men so they wouldn't have to. Maybe that was worth it. Maybe that was the only thing that made it worth it. She pushed open the door and stepped inside to face whatever came next. The investigation room smelled like old coffee and fluorescent lights that had been burning too long. Eliza sat in a metal chair that was bolted to the floor facing a table where 3 people arranged papers and recording equipment with the methodical precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times. Commander Torres, a legal officer whose name tape read Peterson, and Dr. Rebecca Thornton, the base medical officer who'd been called in to provide expert testimony on the injuries. It was 1,400 hours, 6 hours since the demonstration, 6 hours since 7 seconds had changed everything. Eliza's ribs ached, her hip throbbed, the split on her lip had stopped bleeding but felt like it was going to crack open every time she spoke. She'd declined painkillers, needed to stay sharp, needed to remember every detail because details were what separated justified self-defense from assault. Torres slid a tablet across the table. Security footage, 3 angles. I need you to watch it and walk us through your decision-making process. Eliza took the tablet, pressed play. The footage was sterile, clinical, No sound, just high-definition video from multiple cameras that had captured everything. Her kneeling in the ring, Garrett and Wade positioning themselves. The moment of stillness before violence, then the attack. Fast even in playback, brutal in its clarity. She watched herself get kicked, watched her body slam into the concrete, watched herself lie there for 3 seconds that looked like 30, then watched herself stand. The rest unfolded exactly as she remembered. Wade's lunge, her redirect, the pivot, the heel strike, his fall, Garrett's charge, her rotation, the lateral strike to his knee, his collapse. 7 seconds, beginning to end. She set the tablet down. They executed a coordinated assault with clear intent to cause injury. I assessed immediate threat to my physical safety. I issued verbal warning that live response protocol was activated. They ignored it. I neutralized both threats using minimum necessary force calculated to stop their attack without causing permanent disability. Then I immediately transitioned to medical response and directed casualty care. Peterson, the legal officer, leaned forward. Walk me through minimum necessary force. Senior Operator Brennan requires reconstructive knee surgery. Trainee Hollister has a spiral fibula fracture and grade 3 ankle dislocation. Those aren't minor injuries. No, sir, they're not, but they're also not permanent disabilities. Both men will recover full function with proper rehabilitation. The alternative was allowing them to continue attacking me, which would have resulted in either my incapacitation or a requirement to escalate to more severe defensive measures. More severe how? Eliza met his eyes. Strikes to the head or neck, joint destruction beyond repair. Tactics designed to permanently disable rather than temporarily neutralize. The room went quiet. Dr. Thornton spoke for the first time. Her voice was clinical, detached the way doctors sounded when they were delivering difficult news. I've reviewed both men's injuries. Captain Harlow's assessment is correct. Brennan's knee can be repaired. 12 to 14 months rehabilitation, but he'll regain full range of motion. Hollister's fibula and ankle will heal. 8 to 10 months. Both men will be able to return to active duty with proper treatment. She paused. If she'd wanted to permanently disable them, she had multiple opportunities to do so. She didn't take them. Torres made a note on his tablet. The footage shows you removed your rank insignia before the final engagement. Why bother? To eliminate any question about whether this was assault on a superior officer. I wanted it clearly documented that I was engaging as a combatant, not as their commanding officer. That this was mutual combat under training protocols, not a violation of UCMJ Article 90. That shows premeditation. Yes, sir, it does. I premeditated my legal defense while being attacked. I'd do it again. Torres almost smiled. You're either very smart or you've done this before. I've never broken anyone's bones before today, sir. But I've been in enough situations where documentation mattered to know that protecting yourself legally is as important as protecting yourself physically. Peterson pulled up something on his own tablet. We've collected witness statements. 47 so far, all consistent. Brennan and Hollister attacked first. You warned them. They ignored the warning. Response was defensive. He looked up. We've also collected statements about what led up to the attack, about Senior Operator Brennan's brother, about Kandahar. Eliza said nothing. Lieutenant Nathaniel Brennan submitted a written statement, Torres said. He pulled out a paper, placed it on the table. I'm going to read part of it. Captain Harlow saved my life 4 years ago under sustained enemy fire while performing emergency surgery. She fought off 3 Taliban fighters while keeping me alive. She chose to save me knowing I would be paralyzed. My brother Garrett blamed her for my disability. I never did. She gave me 20 more years with my wife and daughters. Today she defended herself against my brother's assault. She showed restraint I didn't know was possible. She could have killed him. She stopped at incapacitation and immediately treated him. That is the definition of a warrior healer. The words hung in the air. Torres set the paper down. That's a strong endorsement. Lieutenant Brennan is a good man who made peace with his injuries. His brother hasn't. That's not my responsibility. No, Torres agreed. It's not, but it's context. He closed his tablet. Based on the evidence, I'm ruling this justified self-defense under training protocols. No charges will be filed. Senior Operator Brennan and trainee Hollister will face administrative action for assault on an instructor during a training exercise. Brennan will be medically discharged pending surgery outcome. Hollister will be removed from the SEAL pipeline for 18 months and required to undergo psychological evaluation. Eliza felt something release in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the absence of a weight she'd been carrying since the moment she'd stood up from that concrete. However, Torres continued, Master Chief Kavanaugh has submitted a request that you be assigned as Chief Instructor for the Combat Medicine Integration Program. I'm approving that request. Effective immediately. Dr. Thornton slid a folder across the table. Program overview, 20 female combat medics, 16-week course. You'll teach advanced trauma medicine and defensive protocols. Budget is $2.3 million. Congressional oversight has been waived. You have full autonomy over curriculum and standards. Eliza opened the folder, scanned the first page. 20 names, 20 women from different branches, different backgrounds, different reasons for volunteering, all of them about to learn what she'd learned today. When do I start? She asked. You have 6 weeks to develop curriculum and prepare facilities. First class reports Monday, October 28th, 0600 hours. Torres stood. One more thing. What you did today will spread. Fast. You're going to become famous in ways you probably don't want. How you handle that will set the tone for this program. Understood, sir. Do you? Because right now you're the medic who broke 2 SEALs. That's the story. Your job is to turn it into something else. Something that helps instead of hurts. He left. Peterson and Thornton followed. Eliza sat alone in the investigation room with a folder full of names and a reputation that had been built in 7 seconds and would follow her for the rest of her career. She thought about Garrett Brennan in surgery right now, doctors rebuilding his knee with pins and screws and synthetic ligaments. About Wade Hollister in recovery learning that 18 months of his life had just been erased because he'd followed the wrong man's lead. About the 20 women whose names were in this folder who would arrive in 6 weeks expecting to learn combat medicine and would instead learn something harder. That proving yourself required precision, control, the willingness to use violence only when forced, and the discipline to stop the moment the threat was neutralized. She closed the folder, stood, walked out into the California afternoon where the sun was still shining and the Pacific wind still smelled like salt, and somewhere in the distance, helicopters were still running their eternal training patterns. The world had continued while she sat in that room. It always did. Individual dramas played out against backgrounds that didn't care, didn't stop, didn't pause for reflection or processing or anything else. She walked back to her quarters. Small room, single bed, desk, locker. The Spartan accommodations of someone who'd spent their entire adult life moving from base to base, deployment to deployment, never staying long enough to accumulate possessions or put down roots. On the desk was her laptop. She opened it, pulled up the email account she rarely used, found the message she was looking for sent 4 years ago, filed in a folder she'd labeled Kandahar. From Nathaniel Brennan, Navy. Mill subject. Thank you date March 15, 2021. Captain Harlow, I'm writing this from Walter Reed Medical Center, where I've been for the past 6 months. The doctors tell me I'll never walk again. They're probably right. My T12L1 vertebrae were too damaged. The shrapnel destroyed too much tissue. But I'm alive. I can hold my wife, play with my daughters, see them grow up, graduate high school, get married, have children of their own. I get 20 or 30 or maybe 40 more years I wouldn't have had if you hadn't worked on me for 47 minutes while people were shooting at you. My brother Garrett is angry. He thinks you should have done something different. Saved my legs somehow. I've tried to explain that you saved my life, and that's enough. He doesn't listen. Maybe someday he will. I wanted you to know that I don't blame you. I'm grateful. Every morning when I wake up next to my wife, I'm grateful. Every night when I read to my daughters, I'm grateful. Every moment I get that I wouldn't have had without you, I'm grateful. Thank you for my life. Nate attached was the photograph, the one she'd carried to the demonstration this morning. Nathaniel in his hospital bed smiling despite everything, and next to him in a wheelchair that he was just learning to use, looking uncertain but alive. Eliza read the email again, then closed it, filed it back where it belonged. Someday she'd show this to the 20 women in that folder, Show them why the job mattered, why precision under pressure wasn't just about technique. It was about the lives connected to the bodies you worked on, the futures you preserved or destroyed with choices made in seconds. But not yet. First, they needed to learn the basics. How to turn momentum into advantage. How to identify joint vulnerabilities. How to stop threats without becoming threats themselves. 7 seconds had changed everything today. But those 7 seconds had been built on 8 years of preparation, 10,000 hours of practice, countless repetitions of movements until they became automatic. Muscle memory that bypassed thought and went straight to execution. That's what she'd teach them. Not the violence. The preparation that made violence controllable. She looked at the folder on her desk. 20 names, 20 women who were about to learn that integration wasn't about policies or quotas or statements. It was about performance under pressure that couldn't be denied. Eliza pulled out a notebook, started writing, curriculum outline. Week 1, biomechanics and leverage principles. Week 2, joint anatomy and failure points. Week 3, momentum redirection techniques. Week 4 through 16, progressive integration of combat medicine and defensive protocols under increasingly realistic conditions. She wrote for 3 hours, covered 12 pages front and back with notes, diagrams, training progressions. By the time she stopped, she had the skeleton of a program that would either prove integration worked or provide ammunition for people who wanted to argue it didn't. No pressure. Her phone buzzed. Text message from Master Chief Kavanaugh. Dinner, my place, 1900 hours. Don't be late. She checked the time. 16:47 hours. Enough time to shower change, pretend she was someone who hadn't spent the morning breaking bones. Kavanaugh lived off base in a small house that overlooked the Pacific, 20 minutes from Coronado. Eliza had been there once before years ago when she'd graduated from his training program. He'd invited the entire class for beer and barbecue and stories about Desert Storm that had gotten progressively more unbelievable as the night wore on. She pulled up to the house at 18:55 hours, early, but Kavanaugh would expect that, would judge her for being late but wouldn't comment on being early. That was his way. Expectations communicated through silence. He opened the door before she knocked. You're bleeding. Eliza touched her lip. The split had opened again sometime in the last hour. It's nothing. It's something. Come in. The house was exactly as she remembered. Minimal furniture, military memorabilia on the walls, photographs from deployments, commendations, a shadow box with his medals arranged in precise rows. The home of a man who'd spent 40 years in uniform and didn't know how to be anyone else. Kavanaugh handed her a towel with ice wrapped inside. Sit. Press that to your face. She sat, pressed. The cold helped. He disappeared into the kitchen. Returned with 2 plates. Steak, potatoes, vegetables, simple food cooked well. He set one in front of her. Eat. They ate in silence for 10 minutes. Kavanaugh had never been big on conversation during meals. Food was fuel. You consumed it. Then you talked. Finally, he set his fork down. How are you sore? That's not what I asked. Eliza set her own fork down. I don't know. I did what I had to do, but it doesn't feel like victory. It's not supposed to. Victory against men you don't want to fight never feels good. It just feels necessary. Garrett Brennan is in surgery right now because of me. Garrett Brennan is in surgery because he attacked you during a training demonstration. Cause and effect. Don't confuse them. His brother wrote a statement supporting you, defending you, explaining that you made the only choice that kept him alive. You're not responsible for Garrett's inability to accept that. Eliza looked at her plate, at food she didn't want anymore. 20 women are going to show up in 6 weeks expecting me to teach them. What am I supposed to teach them? How to break bones. You're supposed to teach them what I taught you. That skill beats strength. That preparation beats panic. That discipline beats aggression. He paused. And yes, sometimes you teach them how to break bones. Because that's reality. That's what combat medicine looks like when combat finds you. They're going to hate me. The men on this base, I just became the woman who proves their worst fears about integration. Some will, others won't. The ones who matter will see past the 7 seconds to what came before. 8 years of training, 3 deployments, countless hours of preparation. They'll see competence, the rest will see what they want to see, and that's not your problem. He stood, walked to a cabinet, pulled out a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses, poured, handed one to Eliza. Desert Storm tradition, he said. After your first real combat, you drink with your instructor. That wasn't combat. Wasn't it? He raised his glass. You faced a threat. You neutralized it. You protected yourself and maintained your ability to complete your mission. That's the definition of combat. The fact that it happened in a training ring doesn't change what it was. They drank. The bourbon burned going down, but it was a good burn, the kind that reminded you that you were alive, and that being alive sometimes hurt, but was worth it anyway. Kavanaugh refilled the glasses. I want to tell you about Captain Maggie Ashford, the real story, not the sanitized version I told you before. Eliza waited. We protested, went up the chain, said we didn't want her, said she'd get us killed. Command ignored us, put her in charge anyway, so we made her life hell, questioned every order, challenged every decision, made jokes, made her prove herself every single day. What changed? She saved our lives. Scud missile intel came through. New route orders. Captain Ashford wanted to divert. We argued, said she was being paranoid, said the original route was fine. She pulled rank, made us divert. 3 minutes later, a Scud hit our original route, killed 2 other convoys that hadn't diverted. 80 men dead. We lived because Captain Ashford was paranoid enough to trust her instincts over our opinions. Did you apologize? Every man in that convoy apologized. She said the same thing to all of us. Save your apologies. Just trust competence when you see it. He looked at Eliza. You know what I learned that day? That my pride almost got me killed. That my assumptions about who could lead were built on nothing but fear and tradition. That competence has no gender and skill doesn't care what you believe about it. Why are you telling me this? Because you're going to face the same thing Captain Ashford faced. Men who don't trust you, men who question you, men who make you prove yourself every single day. And you're going to be tempted to match their hostility, to prove them wrong with anger. He leaned forward. Don't. Prove them wrong with precision, with consistency, with results they can't deny. That's what Maggie did. That's what you did today. That's what you'll teach those 20 women to do. Eliza turned her glass in her hands, watched the bourbon catch the light. What happened to Captain Ashford? She retired in 2005 as a brigadier general, died in 2019. Cancer. I went to her funeral. 2,000 people. Half of them men who'd served under her. Men who'd protested her assignments and then learned to respect her. Men whose lives she'd saved by being better at her job than we wanted to admit. Did she know that she'd changed things? I told her, at her retirement ceremony. Told her she'd taught me the most important lesson of my career. She smiled and said, good, now go teach someone else. Wow. So that's what I've been doing for 20 years. Teaching people that competence matters more than assumptions. That skill matters more than tradition. He raised his glass. And today I watched my best student teach 282 men that lesson in 7 seconds. So here's to you, Captain Harlow, for doing what needed doing and not apologizing for it. They drank. The bourbon was gone. The sun was setting over the Pacific, turning the sky orange and purple and gold. Eliza felt the weight of the day settling into her bones. The adrenaline was long gone. Now there was just exhaustion, the kind that came from trauma, physical and emotional, that would take days to process. I should go, she said. One more thing. Kavanaugh stood, walked to the shadow box on the wall, opened it, pulled out a knife. Not the K-bar he'd given her 8 years ago. This one was older, worn. The handle was wood smoothed by decades of use. The blade had been sharpened so many times it was narrower than it should have been. This knife, he said, was issued to me in 1980. I carried it through Desert Storm, through Somalia, through every deployment for 20 years. It saved my life 3 times, killed 2 people, cut through more rope and canvas and plastic than I can remember. He held it out to her. Master Chief, I can't. You can and you will, because you're going to train 20 women who'll train 200 more, who'll train 2,000 more. And every single one of them will need to understand that they're part of something bigger than themselves. That what you did today, what they'll learn to do is connected to what I did in 1991 and what Captain Ashford did before that, and what every soldier who's ever had to prove themselves has done since the beginning. Eliza took the knife. It was heavier than she expected. Dense, solid. The weight of history made physical. This is your legacy now, Kavanaugh said. Your job is to pass it forward. Teach them, train them, make them so good that no one can deny they belong. That's how cultures change. Not with policies, with performance that makes the old arguments irrelevant. She turned the knife over in her hands, saw decades of use etched into every surface. Imagine Master Chief Kavanaugh at 24 carrying this through the desert, at 35 carrying it through Mogadishu, at 50 finally putting it away because he'd taught enough people that it was time to let someone else carry the weight. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, just don't waste it. 20 women in 6 weeks. Make them better than you. That's the only thanks I need. She left as the sun finished setting, drove back to base with a knife that had history and expectation and legacy pressed into every molecule of its steel, parked outside her quarters, sat in her car for 10 minutes, watching people move through the base, living their lives, unaware that everything had changed today, even if they didn't know it yet. Tomorrow, the formal after-action review, paperwork, documentation, the bureaucratic machinery of turning violence into reports. Next week, meetings with Naval Special Warfare Command about the integration program, budget approvals, facility assignments, the logistical machinery of turning ideas into reality. 6 weeks from now, 20 women reporting for training, 20 pairs of eyes looking to her for answers, for guidance, for proof that what they were attempting was possible. And 8 years ago, a 20-year-old woman standing in front of Master Chief Kavanaugh, learning for the first time that strength wasn't about muscles. It was about preparation, about discipline, about the willingness to do hard things when hard things were required. She'd come full circle, from student to instructor, from learning to teaching, from proving herself to helping others prove themselves. Eliza got out of her car, walked to her quarters. Inside the folder with 20 names sat on her desk. She opened it, started reading. Lieutenant Jessica Hartley, Army Combat Medic, 2 deployments, Afghanistan. Notes indicated history of harassment in previous unit. Transfer request approved after formal complaint was dismissed for insufficient evidence. Sergeant Kimberly Vaughn, 29, Navy Hospital Corpsman, 1 deployment, Iraq. Notes indicated she'd been removed from Special Operations Medical Training Pipeline after instructors claimed she couldn't handle the physical requirements. Her fitness scores were higher than 70% of male candidates who'd passed. Corporal Alexis Brenner, Air Force Pararescue Trainee, 0 deployments. Notes indicated she'd been told repeatedly she was too attractive to be taken seriously by male trainees. Had filed 3 separate complaints, all dismissed. 20 women, 20 stories of being dismissed, harassed, underestimated, told they didn't belong. 20 women who'd volunteered for this program, knowing it would be harder than anything they'd faced before, knowing they'd be tested not just on skill, but on their willingness to endure doubt and skepticism and outright hostility. 20 women who needed someone to show them it was possible. Eliza pulled out her notebook, started writing new notes, not just curriculum, strategy, how to build confidence without arrogance, how to teach violence without glorifying it, how to prepare them for men like Garrett Brennan who would test them, not because they were unqualified, but because they represented change that scared people. She wrote until 0200 hours, until her hand cramped and her eyes burned and the words started blurring together. Then she closed the notebook, set it on the desk next to Master Chief Kavanaugh's knife. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Next week would bring more. 6 weeks would bring 20 women who needed her to be something she'd never been before. Not just a soldier, not just a medic, a teacher, a mentor, a bridge between what was and what could be. She thought about Garrett Brennan in his hospital bed, learning to accept that his hatred had cost him his career. About Wade Hollister in recovery, learning that following the wrong person led to wrong places. About Nathaniel Brennan in his wheelchair, who'd learned 4 years ago that survival sometimes required accepting losses you didn't choose. about the 282 Navy SEALs who'd witnessed 7 seconds that would become stories, that would become legends, that would shape how people thought about integration and competence and what women could do when they were properly trained. About Captain Maggie Ashford, who died before Eliza could thank her for the path she'd cleared, who'd faced hatred and skepticism, and men who wanted her to fail, and who'd responded with competence so undeniable that even her enemies had to respect it. Eliza pulled Master Chief Kavanaugh's knife from her pocket, set it next to the K-bar he'd given her 8 years ago. 2 knives, 2 generations. One lesson passed forward. Competence has no gender. Skill doesn't care what you believe about it. Preparation beats assumptions. Performance makes arguments irrelevant. That's what she'd teach. Not just to 20 women, to everyone who watched them, everyone who judged them, everyone who needed to see that integration wasn't about lowering standards. It was about recognizing that standards had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with preparation, discipline, and the willingness to do hard things when they were required. 7 seconds had changed everything today, but those 7 seconds were just the beginning. The real work started in 6 weeks when 20 women walked into her classroom and asked her to teach them how to do the impossible. And Eliza would teach them. Not because it was easy, not because it would make her popular, but because Master Chief Kavanaugh had taught her, and Captain Maggie Ashford had taught him, and somewhere back through the decades, someone had taught everyone who'd ever had to prove they belonged against people who didn't want to believe they could. That was legacy, not the violence, not the broken bones, the passing forward of knowledge and skill, and the unshakable belief that competence mattered more than anything else. She set the knives on her desk where she'd see them first thing every morning. Reminders, promises, the physical weight of expectations in history and the future waiting to be written by women who were tired of being told they couldn't. 6 weeks, 20 women. One chance to prove that what happened today wasn't an exception. It was the new standard. Eliza turned off the light, but the story didn't end there. 1 year later, Naval Special Warfare Group 1, September 2025. The training facility had a new name now. Stenciled in black letters above the entrance, Kavanaugh Harlow Combat Medicine Center. Master Chief Kavanaugh had protested when Commander Torres announced it at the dedication ceremony. Said his name didn't belong on a building. Torres had overruled him. Some arguments you didn't win. Eliza stood in the observation room overlooking the main training floor. Below her, 20 women moved through defensive protocols with the kind of precision that came from 16 weeks of repetition. Class 3, the third cohort to graduate from the program. 60 women total now. 60 pairs of boots that walked differently because of what they'd learned here. Lieutenant Jessica Hartley was on the floor as assistant instructor. The woman who'd frozen during week 1 of Class 1 was now teaching Class 3 how not to freeze, how to redirect momentum, how to identify joint vulnerabilities, how to stop threats without becoming threats themselves. Jessica demonstrated a technique on a male SEAL volunteer, 220 pounds. He came at her full speed. She rotated, caught his wrist, used his momentum against him. He hit the mat controlled, got up, nodded respect. The kind of nod that said more than words. A year ago, that nod wouldn't have existed. Now it was standard. Eliza checked her watch. 1,400 hours. Time for the meeting she'd been dreading for 3 days. She walked across the compound to the medical building. 3rd floor, conference room at the end of the hall. The door was open. Inside, Garrett Brennan sat in a chair that wasn't a wheelchair anymore. He'd graduated from it 6 months ago. Physical therapy, reconstructive surgery. 10 months of work that most people wouldn't have had the discipline to complete. But Garrett Brennan, for all his faults, had discipline. He stood when she entered, still had a slight limp. The knee would never be what it was, but he could walk, could run, could do everything except return to SEAL operations, which the Navy had decided for him when they issued the medical discharge. Captain Harlow. His voice was different now, quieter, like someone had turned down the volume on his anger and he was still learning how to speak at normal levels. Mr. Brennan. She'd stopped calling him senior operator 6 months ago when the discharge became official. He'd stopped flinching at the civilian honorific 3 months ago. They sat across from each other, between them a folder. Garrett pushed it toward her. Licensed counselor certification, he said. Specialization in veteran anger management and PTSD treatment. Started seeing clients 2 weeks ago. 3 so far. All of them men who blame someone else for their problems. I'm good at recognizing the pattern. Eliza opened the folder, scanned the documents. Everything official, state licensing board, VA approval. References from the therapist who'd worked with him during his own treatment. Why are you showing me this? She asked. Because I want to work with your program. Not as an instructor, as support. For the women who have been harassed, assaulted, told they don't belong. I want to help them process what happened to them. And I want to do it here. Where he paused, chose his words carefully. Where I learned what rock bottom looks like. Eliza closed the folder. You attacked me during a training demonstration because you blamed me for your brother's wheelchair. You spent 4 years building a narrative where I was the villain. What changed? 10 months of therapy and a conversation with Nate. Garrett looked at his hands. He came to see me 3 weeks after the surgery, rolled into my hospital room. First thing he said was, "You're an idiot." Not, "How are you feeling?" Not, "I'm sorry this happened." Just, "You're an idiot." Garrett smiled, barely. He told me he'd spent 4 years trying to make me understand that Captain Harlow saved his life, that the wheelchair wasn't a prison, it was a second chance. He said I was so busy being angry about what he'd lost that I couldn't see what he'd gained. 20 years with his wife, watching his daughters grow up. He asked me if I thought he'd trade all that for legs, if I honestly believed he'd rather be dead. What did you say? Nothing, because I knew the answer, and I knew I'd been wrong for 4 years. He met her eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Captain. I don't deserve it. I'm asking for a chance to turn what I did into something useful. To help people who are where I was, angry, blaming, destroying themselves. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, she could see the training compound, could see Class 3 still working through drills, could see the future being built one repetition at a time. The women in this program have been harassed by men who sound a lot like you did a year ago, she said finally. Men who told them they didn't belong, who questioned their competence, who made them prove themselves every single day. You want to help them? Yes. Then you need to understand something. They don't need your apology. They need your honesty. They need you to tell them what you learned. Not about me, about yourself, about the fear underneath the anger, about what it costs to blame someone else instead of facing what you can't control. Garrett nodded slowly. I can do that. Then we'll try it. 1 session. Class 4 starts in 2 weeks, 20 new women. You'll meet with them week 8, after they've learned the defensive protocols, after they've proven to themselves that they're capable. You'll tell them your story, what you did, why you did it, what it cost you, and what you learned. And if they don't want to hear it, then you'll have learned something else. Eliza stood. This isn't about redemption, Garrett. You don't get to feel better by helping them. This is about preventing the next version of you from destroying someone the way you tried to destroy me. Understood. Understood, Captain. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back. Your brother was right. You were an idiot, but idiots can learn. That's the only reason we're having this conversation. She left him sitting there with his folder and his limp and his second chance. 18 months later, December 2026. The base was quiet. Most personnel had taken holiday leave. Eliza worked alone in her office in the Kavanaugh Harlow Center. Outside, the Pacific churned under winter storms that had turned the sky the color of old iron. Her laptop screen showed statistics, numbers that had stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like people. Her phone buzzed. Text message from Jessica Hartley, now stationed in Kandahar, the same base where Eliza had saved Nathaniel Brennan 6 years ago. Captain, performed first hot extraction under fire today. T10N T11 button fracture, patient stable, used everything you taught me. He's going to make it. Thank you for teaching me how. Attached was a photograph, Jessica in full combat gear, blood on her gloves, exhausted smile. Behind her, a medevac helicopter lifting off into the Afghan dusk. Eliza stared at the photograph for a long time, saw herself 6 years ago, saw the beginning and the continuation, saw what Master Chief Kavanaugh had meant when he'd said legacy wasn't about you. It was about who came after. She closed the laptop, locked her office, walked out into the December cold. The base felt different now. 18 months of women proving themselves had changed something fundamental. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough that you could feel it in how people moved, how they talked, how they stopped questioning and started accepting. She drove off base. 20 minutes to the house Master Chief Kavanaugh had sold her before moving to Montana. Same view of the Pacific, same sparse furniture, same shadow box on the wall, though now it held two knives. The K-bar he'd given her 8 years ago. The Desert Storm knife he'd given her 18 months ago. She'd added something else to the shadow box. The photograph. Young Kavanaugh and Captain Maggie Ashford in Kuwait, 1991. The beginning of a promise that had led to this moment. Her phone buzzed again. Email this time. From Commander Torres. Subject promotion orders, Captain Harlow. Effective January 1st, 27. You are promoted to Major and reassigned as Director Combat Medicine Integration Program, Naval Special Warfare Command. Congratulations. You earned it. Torres. She read it twice. Let it settle. Major. Director. Words that meant responsibility, authority. The ability to expand what she'd built from one base to the entire Naval Special Warfare System. She thought about responding, decided it could wait until morning. Instead, she poured bourbon into 2 glasses, set one on the table in front of the shadow box. The other she held, a toast to ghosts, to Master Chief Kavanaugh fishing in Montana, to Captain Maggie Ashford dead 7 years but still teaching lessons, to Nathaniel Brennan and his daughters, to Garrett Brennan learning to help instead of hurt, to Wade Hollister completing his counseling and reapplying to the SEAL pipeline with a new understanding of what strength meant, to 120 women who'd graduated and hundreds more who would, to 7 seconds that had changed everything and 8 years of preparation that had made those 7 seconds possible. She drank. The bourbon burned the same way it had 18 months ago when Master Chief Kavanaugh had first told her about Desert Storm traditions, about what it meant to survive your first real combat and live to talk about it. Outside, the Pacific hammered the coastline with the kind of violence that had been happening for millennia and would continue long after she was gone. Constant, relentless, indifferent to individual struggles. But inside this house on this night, Eliza Harlow allowed herself something she rarely permitted. Satisfaction, not pride, not victory, just the quiet knowledge that she'd done what Master Chief Kavanaugh had asked, what Captain Maggie Ashford had started, what every person who'd ever had to prove themselves against people who didn't believe had accomplished. She'd passed it forward, and it hadn't ended with her.